today we have quite an interesting case. This family actually was featured on Wife Swap. The family that we are talking about today is the Stockdale family. So back in 2008, season 4 of the original Wife Swap aired, and the Stockdales, a family of 6 who were based out of Stark County, Ohio, were among the families that were featured. Their family included their parents, Tim and Catherine, as well as their 4 sons, Calvin, Charles, Jacob, and James. Now, the Stockdales lived in a rural town on a farm, and the boys were raised very conservatively. And I don't mean that politically necessarily, but instead, their access to traditional media and traditional upbringing was extremely limited. For example, the boys were not allowed to watch TV, play video games, date. They couldn't listen to any rap or hip hop music. Growing up, the boys were also heavily influenced by bluegrass music, and it was a big part of their life. And eventually they started the Stockdale family band. And it wasn't just the boys. Their father was also part of the band. And their mom, Catherine, did not play an instrument herself, but she ended up giving herself the role of band manager. And other than, maintaining their farm and going to school, the Stockdale family band was their biggest responsibility and priority. And the band was relatively successful. They traveled all around the US, competing and actually winning several regional competitions. They still had strict rules around rehearsing for the band. And honestly, strict feels like an understatement. So of course, when they went on Wife Swap, some of these rules that they had were on the show. The wife who swapped with them thought they were very overwhelmingly strict. Of course, they switched with a family who was completely opposite from them, a very liberal family from Illinois who lived nothing like the Stockdales, and their last name is Tonkovic. So Lori Tonkovic was the wife who switched places with Catherine Stockdale. Obviously, they were completely different from the Stockdale family. They were very carefree, and their 2 kids were 21 and 17, and they were super free to go about their lives as they pleased. Lauren even stated that her kids were allowed free reign over anything in their home. The Stockdales, like I said, had a no dating policy, but the Tonkovics actually had the girls' significant others living with them in the home. So drastically different experience for Catherine. So in the episode, Catherine leaves a very detailed family manual for Lori, which laid out everything the boys were required to do every day. And it also includes some details about why she chose to raise the boys this way and how she thinks it will benefit them later in life. The boys were not even allowed to play sports of literally any kind, because she thought they would make them too self-centered and competitive. And one of the important ideals that Catherine really seems to drive home is that nothing is free in their home, everything is earned. And so, of course, she has the boys do a variety of household chores and farm work in order to receive tokens in exchange for that work. And then, they save up their tokens, and if they get enough, they're able to watch a pre-approved family-friendly TV show or have one stick of gum. And Catherine says she stays home to cook, teach, and manage, while Tim runs the farm and works a second full-time job delivering animal nutrients to farmers across Ohio. And Catherine also notes in the show that they have to get A's on all their material before they move forward with new material. And she also explained in the show that, homeschooling gives her the control over what is taught and what moral lessons her sons learn. Then at the end of the day, they have dinner, and after dinner, they must practice their instruments and follow anything outlined in the band's contract. During the episode, Catherine stresses that the number 1 rule in their house is that the kids obey their parents. Specifically in the manual, she says the first rule of this house is to obey your parents. Teaching the boys respect is vital in this modern world where so many children disrespect adults. We don't tolerate any of the boys hurting each other physically or verbally, and insist that if they make a mess, they clean it up. So at the end of the first week, obviously, Lori does not like the way that the Stockdale kids are being raised, and she gets to change the rules. During week 2, Lori allowed a lot of different things, and the boys were honestly pretty uncomfortable with it. For example, she allowed the boys to play video games, which is something they were not used to. And obviously they're going to enjoy it, but they felt extremely guilty. And at one point, Jacob actually ran out crying and told Lori that if he played video games, his parents would tell him that he would burn in hell. And also one of the things that she wanted the boys to experience during her week was to date. So she tried to get Calvin and Charles to go on a date, but they were very, very against it. it. I mean, they were just scared to break any of the family rules, especially with the idea that they would go to hell for doing any of these things. And on the other hand, of course, Catherine was just appalled by all the freedom that Lori's kids had, especially by the fact that they had their significant others living with them. So she decides to teach them a lesson by having them carry babies around that cried, you know, kind of like those dolls that some people get in health class as like a form of birth control, really. They cry when they need to be fed or burped or changed. And the idea with those dolls is to teach teenagers a lesson about the responsibilities that come along with having kids. Of course, by the end of the 2 weeks, both wives are very ready to get back to their life. But before they switch back, they have them all kind of convene and discuss what they learned from each other and really just rip each other's parenting to shreds. And Lori actually ended up calling Catherine a terrible parent, which obviously she was not too happy about. So in the Stockdale house, the kids are eventually able to leave home if they want to once they hit a certain age, although this is highly discouraged. But when they reached college age, Calvin and Charles decided to leave home. Calvin went off to Hinsdale College in Michigan, and Charles went off to study and be a doctor in Philadelphia. So now Jacob and James were at home dealing with all these rules and pressure by themselves. And they still played in their family band without their older brothers. Once Calvin and Charles left, Jacob was now the oldest son living in the home, and he actually joined a second band and won first and second place in a handful of regional contests. And things were, quote, normal for a little while, but that all changed on June 15th, 2017. That day, a 911 call was made to Stark County Police Dispatch, but the caller hung up before stating their emergency. But of course, police were able to trace that call back to the Stockdale residence, and they went ahead and sent a squad car there. So when they got there, 2 sheriff deputies approached the house, and they realized that the front door was left open. So they slowly walk towards the door, and as they do, they look inside and they realize that someone is lying motionless on the floor. Immediately, they call for backup, and then they start giving verbal commands to this person, hoping that they will stand up. But they don't, and they don't hear anything inside at first. Nobody responds to them, but then they hear a loud gunshot come from inside the house. So more officers are on the way, and these deputies decide to go ahead and enter the home. And when they do, they realize that it's Catherine Stockdale that's lying on the ground. And then they realize it's not just Catherine, it's also the youngest brother in the family, James, who is lying motionless on the ground. And it turns out that both of them were dead from a single gunshot wound. And then they found the oldest brother, who's currently living in the house, Jacob, on the ground with a gunshot wound to the head. But unlike his brother James and his mom, he was still alive. So obviously, based on the crime scene and the fact that that last gunshot had gone off after the police had already arrived, they knew that they had walked in on an attempted double murder suicide. So Jacob was rushed to Metro Health Medical Center to be treated for his life-threatening injuries. And they also stated that the murder weapon itself was a 20-gauge shotgun. And after they first spoke with the father, they had no understanding for why this happened. Calvin and Charles were obviously alerted about what had happened back at the family's home, and they were shocked. Calvin actually made a public statement, and he said that James, the youngest of them, was always the catalyst of family fun. He was a gifted musician, loved dancing and people, and was working towards earning his business degree to get into business entertainment. So 3 days after this happened, the remaining family members told the media that they expected Jacob to make a full recovery. The community donated over $14,000 to a GoFundMe to raise funds for the memorial service for Catherine and James. So their GoFundMe eventually reached over $31,000, and those funds were used to help pay for Jacob's medical expenses as well. James ended up requiring care at the Metro Health Medical Center for more than a year in order to recover from the self-inflicted gunshot wound to his head. And obviously, police had to wait for Jacob's condition to improve before they tried to determine a motive or formally charge charged him with anything. So eventually, September 26, 2018, the Stark County Sheriff's Department filed the indictment against Jacob, and later that afternoon, he was made aware of the charges against him. But before they even had the chance to make the arrest themselves, Jacob actually turned himself in for his crimes on September 27, 2018. After that, Jacob's lawyer was given the pretrial date, which was scheduled to take place on October 9th, 2018 at 8 a.m., and his bond was set for $1 million. When the pretrial date came around, Jacob's defense attorney filed a motion to determine competency. Jacob and his attorney ended up submitting a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Eventually, a psychiatric evaluation was performed on Jacob in 2019. However, based on the doctor's evaluation, they determined that Jacob did not have a mental illness that would prevent him from understanding the legal proceedings. So this obviously means that Jacob is going to be standing trial. However, his defense attorney was certain that he was not fit to stand trial, so he asked for a second opinion. So a second psychiatric evaluation was performed, and this time the doctor stated that there was cause for concern and that Jacob was not competent to stand trial. But this doctor also said that Jacob could be restored within a year if he was given intense treatment for his mental health. At that point, of course, Jacob's defense attorney wanted a third opinion, but that was denied because it would have cost taxpayers an extra $5,000. So after hearing the results of both psychiatric evaluations, the judge declared Jacob incompetent to stand trial, and he ordered that Jacob be placed at Heartland Behavioral Healthcare Hospital for treatment. So because of this, the double murder trial was delayed until Jacob would be able to be deemed competent. Additional assessments, of course, were given to Jacob while he was at Heartland, and the mental health officials at the treatment center actually requested the audio from Jacob's phone calls between himself and his family while he was at Stark County Jail. They believed that hearing those calls would help them determine if Jacob was competent because it was suspected that he may have been faking his mental illness. They felt like at the very least they'd be able to get a better idea of who Jacob was by hearing those calls. But during his time at Heartland, he had some hiccups. He actually tried to escape twice. The first one was November 18th, 2019. This was just a few months after his treatment, and I guess he tried to escape by hiding between stacks of books in the library after hours. And then his second attempt was December of 2019, and he tried to get out of there by kind of blending in with people that were exiting the building, and it did not work. So that brings us to January of 2020, and at that point, a psychiatrist determined that Jacob was competent to stand trial. But even though he was at that point deemed competent, he still had to go through a sanity hearing. This is a hearing that would determine if Jacob would spend his sentence in jail or back in the mental health facility. And this was scheduled for March 30th, 2020, and I'm sure March of 2020 rings a bell for all of you. The sanity hearing was pushed to September 8th, 2020. And through the hearing, Jacob often did not respond or even acknowledge the judge. So an additional psychologist found Jacob mentally sane on December 31st, 2020. So a trial date was set with the intention that he would be serving his sentence in a prison. The original trial date was set for January 26, 2021. And because postponing is sort of a theme in this case, of course, that was delayed as well. That made the trial be delayed to May 4th, 2021. So after laying all the evidence out against Jacob and noting a good deal of his bad behavior while in rehab, Jacob's defense lawyer had a chance to speak. He was facing 30 years in prison, and their family literally begged the judge to let him off as easy as possible. But to everyone's surprise, Jacob didn't make it to trial. 1 week before he was supposed to sit before a jury, Jacob pled guilty to the double murder of his mother and brother. And he never offered up a motive for why he did it, although most people suspect it had something to do with his very strict upbringing. So now Jacob is serving 30 years to life in prison, 15 for each murder. The Stockdale family has declined to speak about the case or their thoughts, but they have been very clear through it all that they forgive Jacob and that they love him. And Jacob is eligible for parole in 2048. And to this day, we don't have any answers about why he did this. People can only speculate, and a lot of that speculation comes, of course, from the wife swap episode. But we don't know if there was like a specific event that really sent him over the edge or if this was something he was planning for a while. But it really does seem that Jacob's life was so strict that he was under so much pressure that he snapped. But of course, that's just an assumption, and people have different opinions. So that is all I have for you guys today. Stay safe out there.